we think that Jack the Ripper was most likely an abattoir worker.
Andrew, you are the Australian Sherlock Holmes. In 2017, you published a fascinating paper called "Was Jack the Ripper a Slaughterman?" So tell us about this theory. Was Jack working in an abattoir? Just for a bit of context, because it was done a very long time ago, one theory is that Jack was a surgeon due to his ability to be precise with a knife he used with his victims. But on the paper, you suggest that first in 1888, there were many slaughterhouses in the Whitechapel area. You question whether Jack was a Jewish socher who slaughters and prepares animals according to Jewish rules. And you also talk about Jack's horrible grammar in a letter sent to the authorities, hinting that he might not have been a surgeon or medically trained.
This was a really interesting case that I stumbled upon I'm going to say that again, you can hopefully edit this out. This was a really interesting case that I stumbled onto really by accident. It started when my wife actually gave me a mystery present for my birthday, and it turned out to be a Jack the Ripper mystery tour. And I turned up at Whitechapel Station in East London at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday to discover about 30 other people apparently gathered there as well for some unknown reason. And fairly shortly, we all started what turned out to be a Jack the Ripper tour, and we wandered around the various locations where Jack's murder victims were found, and were shown old grainy black and white photographs of murder victims. And the tour guide was saying that because of his speed and skill at dissection, there was a suspicion that he might have been a trained surgeon. But I looked at some of the wounds on some of these bodies, and it occurred to me that they didn't look like any surgical approaches that I had ever learnt as a veterinarian. Instead, they looked more like butchering cuts. Nothing then happened for quite a long time until I randomly met Dr. Cassie Watson, who was a historian of crime in Victorian Britain. And I told her about my theory, and one thing led to another, and we ended up doing a whole research project on this. And we found a number of interesting things. One is that, as you said, there were a large number of slaughterhouses and abattoirs in the local area in which Jack's murder victims were found. That's because in the 1880s in London, there was not refrigeration and a transportation system, and slaughtering was not industrialized on a large scale and done out of town with products shipped in. Instead, animals were slaughtered quite often during the night, so they were fresh for consumers to buy in the morning, take home and eat that day. As I said, there were no fridges back then. So there was a lot of slaughtering going on in the local area, which would have been an ideal environment to hide organs taken from victims and also bloody murder weapons. And it wasn't uncommon for people to be walking around the streets with who've just come out of the slaughterhouses as workers that had blood on their clothing and themselves. Indeed, Jack's first victim was found about 150 meters, I think, from one of these slaughterhouses. So Jack the Ripper did have an unusual degree of skill and speed at dissecting victims, and one of his victims was manhandled into a corner of a darkened square, killed, dissected, and part of the kidney stolen, all within a 15-minute period between two successive passages of a police constable through that square at about 2 a.m. in the morning in East London. So that's an incredibly fast time frame for anyone to be dissecting an animal or a person and stealing a particular organ. You need a lot of skill and experience with animal dissection to do that. However, what I spotted, which no one had described previously, is that the direction of the incision into the abdomen appeared to be the wrong direction for a surgical approach. And you could tell this by the previous stab incisions before the main incision. There were a number of other small incisions in the region of the groin. So the incision proceeded in the opposite direction to how we are taught as surgeons to proceed. But it is the same direction that you get in abattoirs when animals are suspended by their hind legs and the abdomen is opened up and the abdominal contents are removed. There were some other characteristics of the incision which indicated that the person involved had not undergone any degree of surgical training as well, but still had a lot of speed and skill with dissection, as you would if you worked in an abattoir. The way in which the victims were killed was by throat cutting, consistent with the way that animals are killed in abattoirs and then bled out, actually. And finally, the murderer left a note, which was known to be authentic because he sent it to the authorities with half of the kidney, the other half still retained inside one of the victims. So it was known to be authentic because of this accompanying part of the kidney. And this note spoke about the satisfaction that the murderer felt when he stole the kidney from this woman, and that he took it home and ate it, and cooked it and ate it, but he couldn't actually spell the word kidney, and his general standard of English was extremely crude. So either he hadn't gone through any degree of professional training, particularly not medical training, so couldn't be a trained surgeon, or else he had a degree of imagination that, in my experience going through veterinary school, is very rare amongst the student population in a medical or a veterinary school. So these are just some of the factors that led us to conclude that he most likely was an abattoir worker. We're looking at his skill, the surgical characteristics of the wound, his linguistics, his inability to spell words like kidney, and also the demographics of the area. And on top of all of that, we know that even today, slaughterhouses tend to produce desensitization of the people working within them to extreme violence, because they're constantly involved in killing animals in an industrialized way, dealing with really large numbers, which tends to numb the senses and make everything become routine. There have been a couple of major studies showing that the rates of the most serious and violent crimes spike. They're much greater in communities that have slaughterhouses situated within them. And it's thought that that is because people become desensitized to the routine commission of extreme violence upon animals, and it makes it more likely for them to go and then commit violent acts towards other people. So the slaughtering methods used in the 1880s in East London were even more barbaric than used today. They did not have the benefit of things like pre-stunning. They would use pole axes, which are basically like sledgehammers, to attempt to kill large animals, and often they would not succeed on the first attempt. So the animal welfare problems were severe, and the brutality was high, and the brutalization of people working in those conditions was considerable as well. So there are a range of reasons why we think that Jack the Ripper was most likely an abattoir worker. And because we've got evidence pointing from all these different areas, we think that this theory is more solid than any of the others that have been published so far, which tend to rely upon just one line of inquiry, such as analysis of the paper on which a note was written, for example.